Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
This week on the show, we are returning to a very important film universe for virtual reality. We covered the film The Matrix in Series 1 when we were looking at artificial intelligence, but we had to return to that as an iconic VR world. So this week we're going to be looking at The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, both from 2003.
Yes, these films were released in the same year, not long after each other. I think The Matrix Reloaded was released in May, Revolutions came out in November. It was a very big year for all Matrix stuff. People were properly hyped up about these films. I was quite hyped up about going to revisit these, but we'll get into that as the episode progresses. Matt, should we just get stuck into The Matrix?
Yeah.
Okay, then get strapped into your chair. We're going to plug The Matrix into the back of our heads. We've got our little ports. We're ready. Let's go.
This will feel a little weird. I believe it is our fate to be here. It is our destiny. I believe this night holds for each and every one of us the very meaning of our lives.
So The Matrix Reloaded, 2003, 4 years after the release of the seminal sci-fi classic The Matrix in 1999. I don't know if I saw this at the cinema. Did you go and watch this at the cinema?
No, I didn't see it until after the cinema. So I think I was... I can't remember. I think I watched it at one of my mates' houses when the DVDs came out. So like I completely missed the cinema hype on it.
I'm the same. I didn't see it at the cinema. I saw it on DVD. I think I did go and see Revolutions in the cinema because it was a big event, wasn't it? But I don't know. It felt like, for me, it kind of felt like Reloaded just sort of slipped through the web. I wasn't that hyped up about it. I was just like, oh, there's a sequel to The Matrix coming out. And I just got it on DVD when it was available. But I haven't seen either of these films since then. So a good 15 plus years since I'd seen either of them. And I went in with pretty low expectations watching them again because I didn't really have good memories of either of them, to be honest.
Yeah, I had the same thing because like they have been pretty much universally panned, these two films, by a lot of critics, let's be honest. People have very strong opinions on these two sequels. But so I went in thinking about all of that, had all that sort of baggage going in. But I've got to say, I think I had a much better experience this time going in and watching them. I think I took more away, and I think they've got a lot of interesting themes, and they're saying quite a lot in a limited amount of time, and it can get a bit convoluted, but I think at their core, they're still really interesting in their concepts.
I had basically the same experience. I really enjoyed it. I had a 4-hour Matrix session just watching these.
Fantastic.
And yeah, I enjoyed them much more than I remembered, particularly Reloaded. I think Reloaded is a pretty good film. Revolutions we'll get to later, but that is a bit of a slog. But I did enjoy both of them. You know, it wraps up this story. It's a hell of an undertaking to do these films because, you know, whenever sci-fi has this element of prophecy and religion and mystery, it's an incredibly difficult thing to then try and wrap that up and play that out and show how that works in a believable sci-fi way. And that is essentially what these films are about. You know, you've got Neo emerging as this prophesized the one in the Matrix, and Reloaded and Revolutions are all about that prophecy coming to pass and exactly what that means for Zion and the Matrix universe. So it's a tricky thing to unravel. And I think they do the best they possibly could have done with it, with these two films.
They're both kind of up against it, these sequels, aren't they? Because the first Matrix film, like you said at the start of the show, is so iconic and everybody knows it. And it's just such a tight, well put together film. It was revolutionary at the time. It was just sort of like that perfect film for that moment in time. And just so much stuff afterwards kind of spoofed it and has taken sort of influence from it. I think maybe by the point of 2002, there was a lot to go up against, sort of making sequels and sort of continuing the story on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, The Matrix is one of the best sci-fi films of all time. I think it's one of the best films of all time. That was a big part of my disappointment with the two sequels back in 2003, 4. But it was also a big part of my enjoyment of them, rewatching them this week. I just set all of that aside. I was going in with low expectations, and I was kind of telling myself, like, these films are not The Matrix. I know for a fact they don't live up to The Matrix, and they're not as good as The Matrix. So let's just get into it and see what's going on in these films. And getting over that hump and not being excited about them, I guess, is the point, allowed me to really enjoy them.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we touched upon when we talked about The Matrix in the first series. Like, the fact that these films, like we both thought these films weren't very good when we were talking about the original Matrix, and we were sort of honest about that, and sort of just going in and giving them a second chance, I think, was really important for this episode. So let's talk about Matrix Reloaded then, and sort of like the focus. So I think one of the most interesting things is the fact that so much of it is showing the real world. So in The Matrix, we're shown the Matrix, this simulated version of reality. Whereas in The Matrix Reloaded, one of the interesting concepts is this like city of Zion and the future that humanity's living in. So what did you think about that, and sort of how they showed like the society in Zion and sort of everyday life, and just sort of brought all that together in a depiction of it?
I thought it was pretty cool, mostly. There's a lot about Zion that I actually had forgotten and I thought looked really cool. The central cylindrical column that they get into after they arrive in the docking area, it looks amazing. It's like this infinitely deep cylinder going into the earth with arterial pathways going into the center. It's very Death Star-y.
Yeah.
And it looked awesome. I'm not so sure about the cave bit where they go into the big rave later on. I thought that was a bit odd. What did you think of it all?
I thought it was really, like, I found it really interesting because I kind of had Planet of the Apes kind of flashbacks with it. Like, there's one of the Planet of the Apes sequels takes place underground for a lot of it, and sort of like that's where they meet all the mutants and stuff like that. And the sort of the subterranean caves and everything kind of added a different element to it. And it's like the juxtaposition between that, like the caves and that natural world and those natural formations and all of the technology that's around everywhere. And it's sort of like, it's like that cyberpunky technology again, sort of like dilapidated, greasy, grimy bits of tech everywhere. Sort of, I liked those sort of like those two opposites.
Yeah, and thematically that works for The Matrix, doesn't it? Having that kind of earthy spiritualism in the caves, juxtaposing that against the reliance on technology. They kind of spell it out a little bit with Neo's conversation with the counselor, where he's like, yes, we are dependent on the machines. But that all fits into the Matrix themes quite nicely. So you've got this shell of machinery above with the docks, and below with the water purifying stuff that they've got down there. But it's all wrapped around this core where they have their big, sexy, muddy raves. That's the kind of the core bit of humanity that's protected in that temple enclave in the center of Zion.
Yeah, and like you said, the fact that the real world looks kind of like earthy and run down, it kind of makes it more tangible than the Matrix, because the Matrix itself is quite glossy and all of these crazy things can happen. So the simulation already seems more artificial when compared to the real world and Zion. So I think it's important that the Wachowskis had made it sort of seem more grounded in its sort of appearance and sort of just the way it is, and sort of like even down to how the society works. Like I said, they've got a council, so they've got the council, and then they've got the military aspect in it. They've got like a general sort of looking after all the mechs and the armed forces and the spaceships or whatever they are. So they've got all of that kind of stuff. So I kind of like that sort of in the depiction as well.
Yeah, it's important that we see that world and what's being fought for, because in fulfilling the prophecy, we are seeing the end of the war. The war's coming to a head with the machines, so we kind of need to see what our characters are fighting for. That's what makes these films so different from the first one. This is about the whole universe, whereas The Matrix is just about the experience of this one prophesized person being awoken from the Matrix itself. And the real world is, well, it's just the ship, isn't it? The real world is just the Nebuchadnezzar, I think, in the first film. So we have to see that real world in all its, grimy scariness on the surface, but also its kind of earthy humanity, that's what they're fighting for, and that's what these films are more about. So it's got that big, epic sci-fi scale, hasn't it?
Yeah, and like you say, it's important that they're showing the human population, because that's what Neo is fighting for. And all of these films are about choice, and mainly sort of the choices that Neo has to make. I saw a supercut of all of the times that they use the word choice in all three films. It's up on YouTube somewhere, and just they're constantly ramming home this, because it's all about free will and going up against determinism and prophecy, and all of this kind of stuff is mixed in. So it's really important that we know why Neo is fighting in the first place.
And the other word that comes out in these two films an awful lot, choice is in the first one a lot, but purpose is said over and over again. You said determinism, but I think that determinism is expressed by the characters in the film as purpose. That's the language they use when they talk about determinism, or certainly the machines do. This concept, from what I remember, wasn't really in the first film, but there's this idea that all of the machines have a purpose, and as they would do, as any machine program, it is designed for a purpose, but it actually becomes something important for those characters. It's really core to their understanding of the world. Smith is angry at Neo because he feels like Neo's taken away his purpose, and he's striving to get that back in these two films. And other machine characters are introduced, and their ideas of purpose are really important to them as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because they really expand on this idea of sort of the programs having a purpose, and they're made for a specific thing. So you've got quite a few new programs in this, and there's characters from the original Matrix who we find out are programs as well. So the Oracle, for instance, you never quite know who the Oracle is in the first film, but it's revealed in this that she is a program. She's part of the Matrix. So who are the programs that we're introduced to? So I think the Merovingian is quite an interesting one, because he's kind of on the fringe of everything that's happening. And he deals in helping programs which are no longer needed get out of their situations. Because the main thing that's happening in the Matrix is, if there's a program that's no longer needed or doesn't have a purpose anymore, isn't fulfilling its role, they delete it. And these programs are given more personality by the fact that they want to live. So the Merovingian is a character who's taking these programs and offering them a way out, smuggling them into places, but he's also getting something on the side. So he's got this kind of black market kind of thing going on. So what did you think about him and that side of it?
I love the concept. I'm not so sure I love the character.
Why? Because he's French?
Well, yeah, he's this prissy French dude. He's going on about, he's got this whole thing about cause and effect, causality, again, on the determinism side of the debate, as all programs, or most programs seem to be. But then he expresses this belief in causality by making a woman eat an orgasm cake,
that scene,
to prove his point. It's a very bizarre scene. I did want to talk about the sexuality of these films, not just the Merovingian. I think less so in Revolutions, although we go to the weird fetish club there. But Reloaded in particular is a really sexual film, but in my opinion, it is not a sexy film.
So what do you mean by that then?
Okay, so, well, I mean, everyone's fucking in Zion in the first 20 minutes of the film. They have a rave and it's kind of implied like an orgy in the cave. That's in a montage intercut with a very awkward sex scene between Neo and Trinity.
In the middle of the rave whilst that's going on, yeah.
Yeah. There's the orgasm cake. The Merovingian is like, very sexual. Persephone's got this whole thing where she trades a kiss, and she wants to like feel loved again.
Yeah. And she's got a very impressive cleavage, which is like hard not to notice on screen.
Yeah, Monica Bellucci looks amazing in this film, but I still found it very awkward, that kissing scene with Neo. Cringingly awkward at times.
I'll give you what you want, but you have to give me something.
What?
A kiss. Excuse me.
On the topic of that one as well, did you ever play Enter the Matrix?
No, I think I played The Path of Neo, but not Enter the Matrix.
So Enter the Matrix had that same scene in, but it has Niobe as the person getting kissed. And there's lots of scenes in this because in that you play as Niobe or Ghost, I think it is, and you sort of like find out what they were doing in the film, and it's all sort of interlinked, and they've actually shot specific cutscenes from the film. So they've got that whole scene just with her doing that exact thing, but she has to kiss her. And it's like, it's weird that they've gone to so much effort to really interlink these films with the game, but it kind of makes sense with the fact that it's the Matrix and it's such a franchise.
I guess so. Yeah, it works, doesn't it? Are you saying that those are shot scenes with like Jada Pinkett Smith and? Oh, okay, all right, not like video game footage.
No, there's like shot cutscenes from like they must have filmed them at the same time or soon after.
How strange, but it does work because of the way the Matrix works, and I can sort of imagine Persephone putting other people through that trial because she wants to constantly feel this like emotional connection that she's lost with the Merovingian. Yeah, they're all interesting concepts, but I didn't find a great deal of it very sexy.
It starts so simply. Each line of the program creating a new effect, just like poetry. First, a rush, heat, the heart flutters. You can see it, Neo, yes? She does not understand why. Is it the wine? No. What is it, and what is the reason? And soon it does not matter. Soon the why and the reason are gone. And all that matters is the feeling itself.
You've got the Merovingian. He's this rogue program who is also surrounded by other rogue programs. The twins are an interesting case, and the other bodyguards, because they're all supposed to be like ghosts and vampires and werewolves. The Oracle explains it's those stories are the Matrix just reassimilating these rogue programs doing their rogue program shit, and people see it, and then it just gets wrapped up into like a folklore story. What did you think of that idea?
Well, that reminded me of something. I won't go into it too much in case anybody hasn't listened to our episode on Synchronic, but there's an element in that where a similar sort of thing happens. So it kind of reminded me of that. And sort of like how I thought it was very plausible that in this world of the Matrix where it's all a simulation, any sort of glitches, people would think that they are sort of like mystical creatures or something like that. They come up with an explanation for them. Like the twins in particular, they sort of like do this weird ghosting thing, don't they? Where they sort of phase through cars and whatnot and sort of are flying around. So I think I thought it was a really interesting way to get that in and sort of have a reason for the glitches.
Yeah, it's stuff that I found extremely weird when I first watched the film. But I found myself really enjoying on rewatching it, and I really thought that it fits, like you said, fits with the world quite well, and it's an interesting concept, especially like characters like the Oracle being like, it's like a big reveal that she's a program, but when you're rewatching these films, it fits in perfectly. Like she couldn't be anything other than a program. Otherwise, what is she? Just like a mystical woman who lives in the Matrix by choice and has prophetic powers? That doesn't make any sense. But special abilities because she's a program, that's the only thing that does make sense in the world of the Matrix.
Yeah, exactly. And because she is a program, she's able to potentially read the Matrix more because she knows what's going on. So she's got a better grasp of this whole simulation.
Yeah, and if you accept that fact that she is a program who's willing to help the humans, then that opens the door to this whole universe of programs with grey area motives, which is what these two films get into a little bit more. They do it in the Revolutions a bit more with the family, but Oracle and Seraph, and the twins and the Merovingian, they're antagonists to the heroes, but they're also antagonistic to the agents, right? If the agents were to track them down, they would presumably delete them because they're a rogue element in the system.
Yeah, and it's the same with the Keymaker, who's sort of like being held captive by the Merovingian. He's on the run, isn't he, from the agents, because he's got this sort of like ability where he can get in anywhere because he's the Keymaker. He knows how to get through all the back doors in the program. So he's like, again, the agents have all these, there's all these different sides in the program. It's not as black and white as you think it is in the start. Like, in The Matrix, it was the machines versus the humans. In this, you're showing the grey areas, like you were saying. There's characters who are on the side of the humans, or may not necessarily be on the side of the humans, but they sort of like, they want to live in this world. They've got programs living in the simulation, and they've got humans living in the simulation as well. So one side know what's going on and have some sort of like control over it, and then the other side don't. And I don't know if we've seen this in other films. So in like The 13th Floor and World on a Wire, you've got programs living in that simulation, and then you get humans have the power when they go in, whereas in this, the humans don't have the power. It's the machines which are in control. It's sort of like a weird flip, isn't it?
Yeah, but the idea of control is the same, I guess, isn't it? If you are running the system, you have the control, whether you're a human character or a machine bad guy in the case of The Matrix.
And it's also similar to Tron, isn't it? Because in Tron, you've got programs going about doing different things, and they're like proper characters. They've got personalities. So it's a similar sort of thing going on. And you've got the users in Tron, which have all the sort of like the godlike powers, the like VR superpowers. Whereas in this, Neo is given those sort of superpowers.
Yeah, and he's depicted as at the peak of his powers at the start of the film. So he comes to this messianic realization at the end of the first film. But here we see him in full flow, he'll happily take on 3 agents in a fight at the start of the film. There's a huge fight scene with like 1,000 Agent Smiths, in the first half. He's fully embraced these superpowers that he's able to get in the VR world. And I don't know if we really touched on this when we talked about the first one, because we were really looking at the AI side of it. But all the characters kind of do this, don't they? They're using their knowledge of being in a simulation to bend the rules of reality. Morpheus can do it, Trinity can do it, all of the heroes can do it, and Neo's just like the best at it. But they're able to bend this VR world to their advantage to become superheroes, basically.
And that's sort of one of the things which was going on in Cyberpunk, wasn't it? Because like you get hackers, ordinary people, which suddenly have these abilities to take on big corporations. So it's, again, that sort of theme is throughout both of these.
Yeah, thematically it's very Cyberpunk, isn't it? But I feel like stylistically it diverges from Cyberpunk in that they're using the Matrix, the simulated world, to present it like a superhero film, basically. Whereas the cyberpunk aesthetic would be more about showing you the physicality of like an implant that allows you to punch hard or whatever. I don't know. But it's more, because it leans into the mysticism side in the Matrix, you don't see any indication that they are technologically advanced. You just know that that's happening because we're inside the simulation seeing the representation of it.
Yeah, and the superpower thing, they are superheroes, aren't they? Neo is a superhero. He's flying around doing the Superman pose. But again, that fits in with the sort of a messianic stuff as well, because Superman is basically a god. And they refer to that a lot in the comics and sort of like the other sort of DC fiction. So they've got this sort of like really superpowered person, but he's vulnerable. He's not completely, he's not the be all end all. There, he does have limits, and that's what sort of like happens as the film goes on with Neo.
Yeah, he's pushed to the absolute limits of his messianic superpowers, and that's kind of the point of the antagonistic relationship that he has with Smith. Smith is his, I don't know what, General Zod. What's an appropriate
General Zod works.
Yeah, he's another character that's kind of hacked the system and become a superhero. It's interesting to think about it in terms of like superhero fiction, isn't it? Because it does follow those tropes. Like Neo has to face off, you know, superheroes always have to face off with characters who have like, you know, parallel or similar powers, but with a twist. There's always something different. So in the, you know, like Superman fighting, what is it, Doomsday, the one that in Death of Superman? Yeah. Superman's often just fighting big, strong dudes because that's what Superman is. Smith is strong and fast, but he's not as strong and fast as Neo, so he's got this new superpower, which is duplicating himself, hacking people and taking over their bodies. So he's got the numbers on Neo. He can overwhelm Neo.
Yeah, it's interesting sort of like how Agent Smith's character's changed as well, because he's seemingly destroyed in the first film, but in this one, he, like you said, he's got this new power. But he's trying to escape deletion, isn't he? And his character's kind of like, he's running around trying to find his purpose, like you were saying earlier, but he still doesn't know exactly what that is. So he's kind of like, he's trying to take control of the world by doing what he can, which is make everyone like him. So it's kind of like, it's that machine logic of, I will assimilate everything so that everything, I'm in control of everything because everything is me.
Yeah, and he functionally becomes a virus, essentially, doesn't he? A computer virus. He is a rogue element in the system that is replicating itself with a view to overtaking that system maliciously. He's a computer virus, essentially.
Yeah, definitely. And when Neo's first faced with him, he doesn't know how to combat it, because how do you combat something which is like multiplying and there's no logical way that he can fight him. And that's sort of like shown in the big set piece scene where Neo faces Smith in that park, and there's just like loads of Smiths coming from all angles, and it's just, so that scene as well, that was the scene I was really worried about, because I remember the CGI in that being terrible, but there is also a lot of really good like action sequences, like real life shot scenes in that, which I'd completely sort of like glossed over in my head just so I remembered the weird CGI.
Yeah, I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. It's another example of a scene I thought I hated, but I did enjoy it more than I thought I would. But as soon as the scene started, something that I'd forgotten like just came rushing back to me and made me extremely nervous and uncomfortable, which was that I was talking to my friend Sam about this as well. There's a sound effect in there of
I know which one you mean.
Bowling pins being knocked down as Neo throws one Smith into like a dozen other Smiths. And I'd completely forgotten that it existed. But as soon as the scene started, it just like came back to me. And I was like, oh my God, there's an awful moment with a bowling sound effect. And then I was just on tenterhooks because I couldn't remember when it happened. And I was trying to enjoy the scene, but I couldn't fully enjoy the scene because I knew I was going to hear that, and I knew it was going to make me mad as soon as I heard it. But I don't know, the CGI, I thought it looked all right. It looks a bit silly at times, but that's the Matrix for you, I guess, isn't it?
That scene took 27 days to shoot.
Jesus Christ.
Which is mad. Absolutely mad. And then the later scene on the freeway, that took 3 months to shoot. So these scenes are so complicated just to put together, because we've talked about bullet time and all of those crazy camera effects that they used in the first Matrix. So again, they've got a lot to live up to with this. How can they make these action sequences even more sort of action-packed and big and explosive? How can they sort of add that extra oomph to a scene which has already revolutionized the way that you shoot action sequences?
And I think you have to, because I have to say, like, the I think the first big kung fu scene is Neo fighting Seraph when they first meet, which is really weird. It's just like, there's no reason for them to fight, but they just have this sort of short, complex kung fu fight. And I did sort of feel like, we don't really need this. There's loads of good kung fu in the first film. It actually kind of makes sense to me that you have to step it up to the ridiculous CGI 1,000 Smiths versus Neo and a huge, enormous car chase. You can't just do cool kung fu again. You've done it. You've got that. It's perfect. It was great in the first film. I don't know. Some films can get away with just doing great kung fu over and over, but The Matrix was always more than just a kung fu film. It does other stuff. So, yeah. It's awkward because the CGI is not great, but I do feel it's justified in making a sequel to do more than kung fu.
I've got to say, I was really impressed with the freeway scene because I forgot how much happens in that. And it's the jeopardy's up in that one as well, because throughout the film, you've got Neo and he's got his superpowers. So you know that he can just fly in and save the day whenever he wants. But because it's Trinity and Morpheus having to fight off against the agents and sort of fend all them off and defend the Keymaker, and there's the twins as well, firing machine guns from the car and floating around. There's just so much going on, but they managed to just sort of meld it all in. So you're sort of like engaged completely with this scene and you just can't take your eyes off it because so much is happening.
Yeah, I think it's the high point of the film, of both of these films, actually, both of the sequels. That chase scene is incredible. It's a very, very good action chase sequence, which, you know, it's hard to keep that interesting. It goes on for quite a long time, but it keeps that pace and it keeps the interest going throughout.
Which is important because it's all sort of like the lead up to the big twist of the film, isn't it?
You always told me to stay off the freeway.
Yes, that's true.
You said it was suicide.
Then let us hope that I was wrong.
It's basically the climax, isn't it, in terms of action movie plotting. It's the last action sequence, I think, because then we go into the insane dialogue of the end of the film.
They do like a weird sort of like Ocean's 11 thing before that, don't they?
Oh, yeah.
Where they're talking about the plan and what they're going to do in order to sort of get into this big building so that they can find this room that Neo needs to be in to sort of like do whatever he needs to do. I forget why he had to get into the room.
Well, he has to get into the room because he's told he has to go into the room. That's the whole... It's a bit MacGuffin-y, isn't it? He's given a task by the Oracle near the start, which is the path of the one is to go into the mainframe. And that does turn out to be true by the conversation he has with the architect, but he's basically sent on this wild goose chase, which is the whole plot of the movie, which is hard to remember. I did find myself... I could remember every action sequence from this film almost clear as day, but I couldn't remember any of the plot. And the plot is just a MacGuffin kind of wild goose chase. So you've got to go to this place, but first you've got to get the Keymaker, but the Keymaker's being held by the Merovingian, and the Merovingian's in this club, and his girlfriend wants to kiss you. Like, that's the plot of the film.
That is the length and breadth of the window. Only the one can open the door. And only during that window can the door be opened.
How do you know all this?
I know because I must know. It is my purpose.
You mentioned that Ocean's 11 sequence. I think, so Trinity's like dying in this dream sequence, but I think the Ocean's 11 scene is the only time we get to see the classic kind of dying in the Matrix because you died in the real world. The relationship between the real world of the Matrix and dying is something that's really interesting. I can't remember how much we talked about it when we talked about the first one, but it's a real point of danger for characters in the Matrix. It's the idea of dying in a dream world as well. The dream world virtual reality of the Matrix is another important trope in these films, or particularly in the first one. The idea that characters are waking up from virtual reality into a real world, whereas in other virtual reality films, you enter it mostly voluntarily, and you're aware that it's other world. It's a constructed experience.
And yeah, because there's the amazing scene where Neo has to choose the red or blue pill, and then he has to make that choice in order to sort of like either escape this simulation or continue living in the simulation. And that's something which we sort of mentioned previously. Like, would you live in the simulation if you had the choice and just not know about it? or would you escape the simulation? Like if you were living in your ideal world and you had all these superpowers and like you had all this control, would you want to live in this other world, this reality?
Yeah. Well, nobody who's living in it has the superpowers, do they? It's the people who have actually opted out and escaped that get this empowerment. It's more about safety and comfort, isn't it? Relative comfort. That's the offer of the Matrix simulation, and it's what allows the machines to keep the population imprisoned in the Matrix.
Yeah, because it's basically similar to Sci-Fi in the first film, where the machines say like, okay, we'll look after you if you allow us to control you, kind of thing. So again, it's the machines sort of inflicting this control on people. So they're giving them everything they could want. And they even said like one of the simulations which they initially had was a simulation where everything was perfect, but humanity doesn't want perfect. There's imperfections in being human. And that's part of being human. So even though the machines are trying to control things and offer this kind of like comfort to a degree, they can't do that for humanity because humanity will always sort of fight against it.
Yes, again, it's coming back to this theme of choice and free will, and that becomes even more important in the idea that's like the one thing that finally allowed the Matrix to work, was acknowledging, even on a subconscious level, that you have a choice to stay in or leave. Basically, in the sense that accepting the illusion as reality. That's the choice that 99% of the human population in the Matrix have made, subconsciously.
Why am I here?
Your life is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming of the Matrix. You are the eventuality of an anomaly which, despite my sincerest efforts, I have been unable to eliminate from what is otherwise a harmony of mathematical precision.
So we just mentioned that we've had our action sequence climax. We've then got to go into this whole architect scene. What did you think? Is that an unfair question? What did you think of this scene?
I felt like I had to really pay attention to what he was saying, because this is because the whole film's got loads of philosophy elements thrown in, and it's quite hard to follow in terms of like, it's aimed at teenage boys to a degree with all the action sequences. And I mean, we were sort of like 15, 16 when this film came out. All the philosophy stuff would have gone right over our heads, even though, like, I think at the time I kind of wanted to think that I knew about these kind of concepts and could kind of get a grip on them. But they're all sort of thrown at you at the very end with this scene with the architect. And he's like explaining the big twist. And the big twist is that this has happened before. There has been a one before. In fact, Neo is the sixth version. This is the sixth time they've got to this point. And each time, the person who has become the one has chosen to not go against the machines, but to keep perpetuating the control they have and basically letting them win in order to save humanity and keep sort of like reliving the same loop.
Yeah, so the one obviously is the sum of a remainder of an unbalanced equation inherent to the programming matrix. We all know that. That makes total sense. We all understand that. I don't mind saying that I watched this, several bits of this scene multiple times. I was rewinding a lot because
you know that line though as well. That line, it was in Total Film Magazine. They said it's the worst line ever delivered in a mainstream Hollywood film. They labelled that bit of dialogue as that.
Yeah. Okay. I think we've talked before. I think we talked before about, film writing hyperbole so that you get quoted. But it is a pretty bad line. Just in the whole of the architect's dialogue is so flowery that it just makes it so hard to follow. But the core idea is they had to introduce this element of freedom of choice, even at a subconscious level, and it's leading to this tiny percentage of the population choosing to exit the matrix. And that's just building up, and it's causing resistance in the real world, and it eventually leads to this a conflict a very violent conflict, which is the destruction of Zion. And the one is the kind of culmination of that freedom of choice, right? It's someone who's programmed into the matrix of having a greater degree of freedom of choice. And they use them to, like you said, reset the whole thing. The people who got out all end up getting killed, and they allow one person. Does it make sense? It doesn't quite make sense. They allow one person to be the function of resetting it. Why not just do that? Why not just do it as machines? Why do you need the human to sort of...
There's so much going on. It's hard for them. It's hard to get all of those answers. But I think that's part of it as well. You kind of like have to just take that as read. Like the idea that Neo has to go back to the source in order to reset it, because for whatever reason, he's the only person who can do it.
Is it more about the one being this solitary representation of the idea of freedom of choice? They have to leave it to the humans to work it out of their system almost, and they do that through allowing one of them to make that choice and push that button.
Yeah, I suppose that would make sense. And it's kind of like they've got this systemic sort of belief system implanted in humanity, so that they've got to have someone who is kind of like a sort of messiah. So they need to have one person taking the leap and doing this thing, like rebooting it, like making the sacrifice in order for that to become part of the prophecy again, so that they know that when someone steps up to the plate and this happens again, that will be the prophecy of the one, and there will be another one, but they just don't know about. Yeah, it's very hard to get a grip on.
Yeah, it's okay. I did quite like it, actually. I watched it back a few times and I got my head around it.
I mean, essentially what it is, though, is the film having a scene where it's got a red blue pill scene, but it's the doors. So Neo has to pick which door to go through. And one door will be sort of leading to saving humanity, and the other door leads to saving Trinity. And throughout the film, it's kind of like he's kind of made to look as this person who will do whatever he can for humanity. There's the moment when he's talking to the believers, the true believers of the one in Zion, and he picks them over going to spend time with Trinity, even though he wants to spend time with Trinity. And he's constantly sort of like stepping up and saying like, look, I'll take on these agents. I will sort of like do this for the greater good. But when it comes down to it, he is human. He's ruled by his emotions. So he picks the door which leads to trying to save Trinity, even though he's not supposed to be able to.
But he's able to. I think it's important that he is able to, but he's the first Messiah who's chosen to do it that way. I did quite like the fact that the architect explains that the ones have all felt love for humanity in a more general sense. Basically, he says in a very like florid way that Neo's the first one of these nerdy hackers to ever have a girlfriend. And it's completely upset the whole system.
It's an anomaly. Oh no.
Yeah. So I liked this concept. I did like it. But then the movie ends with something that I really wasn't so sure about, which is that Neo gets out with this knowledge and now he's got like the one powers in the real world.
Yes. And he's saved Trinity as well. He's given her sort of like a heart massage in the Matrix, and that's rebooted her in the real world. But yeah, it ends with this. There's the threat of the machine attack, which is going to happen to Zion. So there's like a time limit on things. And now Neo is able to do something to the machines in the real world. So I think this is the time to move on to the next film and talk about Matrix Revolutions and try and figure out why Neo has these weird powers in the real world. Okay,
let's get on to Revolutions.
So just before we get stuck into the Matrix Revolutions, we just want to take a little bit of time out to talk to you about what's happening over on our Patreon feed. So this week, as a little bonus, we are looking at the Animatrix, which is the anthology shorts collection from the Wachowskis.
Yeah, we get into all the weirdness and wonderful stories told on that compilation. So head on over to Patreon if you'd like to join and check that out. And a massive welcome to Martin and Michelle, our 2 new patrons this week. We're glad to have you on board, and I hope you're enjoying the Animatrix content.
Yes, definitely. Thanks for coming on board. Well, here's a little clip from that episode for you all to enjoy. One of the other things I was thinking about, going back to Kid's story quickly, was so the kid sort of is seen with his parents, and it got me thinking about, so if you're in the Matrix, are you related to anyone in real life? So you don't have parents, do you? Because you're made by the machines. They're genetically engineering all these humans to sort of be power cells. So the people that he thinks are his parents, do they actually have any connection to him at all?
Oh, it's a really good question. I've got no idea. But I mean, the babies are...
I don't know why I expected you to just give me an answer.
Well, the babies are coming from somewhere, aren't they? They're breeding humans or artificially inseminating humans. So that must require a sperm and an egg. So do you just tie it all in and keep a family unit together? But then the question is, why would you need to? Like, if they're all just in the Matrix, then... So then, well, it begs the question, why do people look the way they do in the real world? Why do they look the same? And how does that apply to people who look like their parents, people who have like similar faces to their mum or dad, which is fairly common? When they go out into the real world, they have the same face. So if their parent was also freed from the Matrix, would they have the same face? Or is their parent just a program to keep them placid?
The program Smith has grown beyond your control. You cannot stop him, but I can.
And if you fail,
I won't.
Do the powers make sense in the real world, Matt?
No.
Why? Why do they not make sense?
Why do they make sense?
See, this is the thing. There's no answer. I don't know the minds of the Wachowskis, but in my sort of like head, I thought maybe because he's got some sort of like, he can control certain electrical signals or something. I don't know.
I was disappointed that it never got into the possibility of the real world not being the real world. And I feel like that's so heavily implied by Neo having superpowers in what we believe to be the real world. He's got Matrix powers outside of the Matrix. And, you know, we've seen it in other films. It's done really well in World on a Wire. Well, actually, we talked about how even those films don't get beyond the levels that we see in the films very much. But no one questions it. And I'd never thought about it before watching these films, but now we're looking at a lot of VR films. It seems like a really obvious question to be raised in this film in particular. Why does anyone in the real world believe they're in the real world? Or why does no one question it?
In terms of like how bleak Zion is and everything, they kind of like, they have to accept it's the real world at a point, don't they? Because they're given this option of like the Matrix, which is this idealized, completely fake world where they can do all these things. So to be comparing that to what they're living in, they really sort of hammer that out. But like you said, having Neo have powers in the seemingly real world is a bit of a strange thing to add in. But then it kind of like makes him more Messiah-like, doesn't it? Because he's not just like, he doesn't just have power in the Matrix, he has power wherever, because he is the one. He is this prophesized figure, so that means that he will have these powers wherever he is.
Yeah, fair enough. I think I always have a bit of a reluctance to accept messianic powers and religious elements in sci-fi films and TV, and just accepting them at face value as a thing that exists in the universe. It always jibes a little bit with me. Because I'm not religious, I think, is the problem. And just taking that at face value feels to me more like a fantasy film trope. And that's why I struggle with it a little bit. And But more so in this film in particular, I really thought it was an opportunity to explore other levels of VR. And The Matrix is such a quintessential VR film that it seemed appropriate that they should have done that. And it was a missed opportunity that they didn't.
Yeah, because they kind of like, they do this thing with Agent Smith as well, don't they? Where he enters the real world by taking over someone's body. So it's similar to 13th Floor, World on a Wire. They've got those moments where a simulation, a program is taking over someone else's body to escape their version of the Matrix, their sort of simulated VR world. So in that respect, you've kind of like, you are again kind of setting them up for this kind of three-layered bubble of different simulated realities. Because if Smith can escape one reality and then go out, then why is there not another one on top? Because you said exactly the same thing when we talked about World on a Wire, didn't you?
Yeah. I think it's an inherent problem. It might be an inherent problem with VR films, is that if you introduce the concept of another layer of reality above your own, in terms of filmmaking, it's hard to know when to stop. Or maybe it's not hard to know when to stop. Maybe it's very easy as a filmmaker to know when to stop. And the answer is 1 or 2 levels max, because otherwise you would just be going down the rabbit hole. But for the audience, and particularly I think for you and me, who are spending a lot of time specifically thinking about VR films, it just always leaves an unanswered question of, but what next? What next? What next?
Well, I hate to say it, but Inception kind of like almost sets that up, which we'll get into later on in the series. But there's the moment in the very famous moment in Inception with the dreidel, and that spitting, and sort of like whether it is real, whether it isn't. It's kind of got that question around it. So yeah, looking forward to discuss that one with you later in the series, Matt.
Yeah, okay. Stay tuned for that one later. You mentioned Bane, the character of Bane, Agent Smith's persona in the real world. He was amazing. He's played by an actor called Ian Bliss, and I do remember this from the first time I watched the films. I just can't get over the fact that he looks not loads like Hugo Weaving, but a tiny bit like Hugo Weaving, and he is delivering a performance that is like a dead-on Hugo Weaving impression.
Spot
it's
on.
Eerie, isn't it?
Yeah, he's so good. And I mean, Hugo Weaving as well is having so much fun with Agent Smith in this film, especially because there's so many scenes where he just is delivering such mad dialogue and just crazy facial expressions that he is becoming more sort of like cartoon-like and over the top. But yeah, you're right. The guy playing Bane has really sort of nailed all of those mannerisms down, so that when you are seeing this character who is Agent Smith in the real world, you completely believe it because he says all the right things. He's like acting in the right way. It is Agent Smith for all intensive purposes.
Yeah, I think I got it in my head that Hugo Weaving played Bane and he was wearing prosthetics. But rewatching it this week, it was very obvious that it was not actually Hugo Weaving. And I was just like, what's going on? How is he doing this? It's so good. It almost makes it a bit ridiculous in Revolutions when he's got Trinity captive and he's saying like, Mr. Anderson. And Neo's like, who are you? It's like...
You know who it is, mate. Come on.
Yeah.
You've been fighting him like every 5 seconds in these films. You know who it is.
Yeah. Nobody's called you Mr. Anderson since you left The Matrix. Who the fuck do you think it is?
Yeah, that was a bit frustrating seeing that. And he's just like, what? What's going on?
But a great performance from Ian Bliss and an even greater performance in both of these films, like you said, from Hugo Weaving. He's, cartoonish is the right word. He literally does... like a stock evil laugh after he assimilates the Oracle. Is that in the second one or the third? Yeah,
I think it's in the second one. It's so good.
He just sort of turns around to the camera and he's just like mwahaha, a literal mwahaha. So Reloaded, I felt like had a nice, interesting balance between the real world and the Matrix. We spend a lot of time in the Matrix and we spend a lot of time in the real world. And it's very important, like we talked about, to set up what the stakes are for the real world. I did notice that Revolutions doesn't have a lot of scenes in the Matrix. It's mostly in the real world. We've got characters on the run from Sentinels attacking them, and we've got this huge fight scene in Zion. What did you make of that centerpiece war scene of the invasion of Zion?
Yeah, it felt much more sort of like visceral than the other fight sequences we've seen in the other films, because this big fight in Zion, there's so much build up to it. Like they say in the last one, there's sort of like a time limit, you know it's coming. Everything's really sort of like put up to the max, but it's happening in the real world. So it's not like this kung fu action which we've seen previously. People aren't using superpowers. It's very sort of like grounded. And that's sort of like seen in, for instance, just the heavy mechs that they're using. It's all very sort of like physical, and they're reloading them. They're running around, having to physically reload these machines, and you see people like properly getting killed and mangled by these Sentinels. And then on top of that, you've got the whole bit with the Nebuchadnezzar going around all these sort of like maintenance tunnels and like physically hitting bits and pieces, and you can really feel the intensity of it. Like everything seems more sort of claustrophobic and not sort of like as airy as the scenes we've seen previously, because all of the VR scenes are kind of like in big open spaces a lot of the time. Like the freeway scene we talked about, the sort of the big scene with Agent Smith in the park. They're all sort of big open spaces, where these are all really confined, and because they're subterranean, everything just seems a bit more sort of like dense, and it's sort of like grounding everything. And I really got that sense in this big fight in Zion, that everything's sort of like happening slower, but it's all a lot more physical.
I think you're definitely right in the way it's presented. It's the difference between an action movie and a war movie, isn't it? This is a battle scene in a war movie. I thought it was very reminiscent of scenes in the third Lord of the Rings film. It's the climax of the two armies going head to head. And it's totally different from the more Joel Silver, wham bam action scenes on the freeway. But I have to say, I much preferred the action scenes on the freeway. This was the scene where I really felt like this film is dragging now. Like you're right in the way it functions in the film. I think that all works perfectly well. But I didn't particularly like the scene. I rewound the film when the battle was over. I thought that it had been like an entire hour. I thought that like is the whole middle of this film, or more than just the middle, is like 50% of this film, this fight scene. And I went back, and it's only about 20 minutes long, but 20 minutes is a long time to be in one action sequence. But you're completely right that it has to be that way, because those are the stakes of the whole story. This is potentially the fall of Zion, which is the threat that exists in both of these films. So it has to be a huge, huge deal. I just got a bit bored, to be honest.
Yeah, it does function as sort of like, it's a war scene, isn't it? It adds sort of that element to it. And it is so different to everything we've seen in The Matrix previously. So it doesn't have that sort of like superhero-y elements in it. It's all sort of very, like I said before, grounded. But it is showing you a different side of other characters as well, which I found quite interesting, because you've got Link's, what's her name?
Z,
yeah. So you've got Z, who's running around with the woman with the rocket launcher. So you've got that whole thing. You've got those sort of characters. Then you've got like the general guy in the mech, and there's lots of different components. You're kind of like seeing their fights from the other side. So I kind of like that aspect to it as well. But yeah, I can see what you mean. It's not as visually appealing, maybe, as some of the sort of like the other stuff you've seen previously. But again, it has to be that sort of juxtaposition. But then you've got a similar juxtaposition in the fight that Neo has with Agent Smith on the Nebuchadnezzar. Because again, every fight that we've seen with Agent Smith has been this crazy kung fu, really big visual spectacle. And then suddenly you're seeing Agent Smith fighting Neo in the real world. And that's a completely different sort of style, isn't it?
Yeah, I really like that. That felt gritty and rough. And Trinity's in that as well before Neo gets involved in the fight. And I really liked seeing her like kicking ass in the real world. And I think they do a very good job of making that feel different. She hasn't got her sunglasses on. She's not in her latex catsuit, you know. She's not that superhero. She's vulnerable. You know that the stakes are there, that when she gets punched, she's really getting punched. I mean, it is suggested that the stuff that happens to you in the Matrix, it's all real and it affects your body. But at the same time, she's doing like crazy superhero kung fu, but she's still like really capable, and she like headbutts him from behind, and she's holding her own. And then, the fight with Neo, it's really like, it's a brawl, isn't it? Rather than what we've seen these two characters do previously.
Yeah, and he's not doing like everything as fast as he was in the Matrix, but there's a moment when he kind of like, when he gets blinded, and then he sort of gains this ability to kind of recall how he moves in the Matrix almost. So he starts like combating Smith with these kung fu blocks and things like that. So it kind of like gives him his power back again. But again, it's still sort of like slowed down, and it's all heavier, and it just sort of like makes it more definite that this is the real world and that the Matrix is this sort of simulated reality.
Yeah, he gets blinded, but then his powers allow him to continue seeing. They stole that from Dune. I'll just put that in there.
There's a lot of Dune stuff in this though, isn't there?
Well, yeah, the Messiah stuff, and ideas about prophecy and freedom of choice is very Dune-y. But yeah, I don't know, it's a bit of a spoiler for later Dune books, but they stole that from Dune. It's fine, it's good, like it, like seeing Dune stuff, like talking about Dune. But yeah, that is a cool scene. It was almost a shame that Bane gets killed at the end of that. I think just because I was enjoying Ian Bliss so much, that it was like, he's dead. No more Hugo Weaving impressions.
Mr. Anderson, I see you are as predictable in this world as you are in the other.
What?
He's out of his mind.
It might appear that way to you, but Mr. Anderson and I know that appearances can be deceiving. Confused, Mr. Anderson? It'll all become clear in a moment. Now, thank you for bringing me the gun. You can set it down right there.
Don't do it. Shoot. Shoot now.
Yes, shoot. Fry us. Burn us alive.
Do it. If you don't, he'll kill us both.
So Neo gets blinded, and now he can see lights whenever he sees mechanical stuff. Lovely. Absolutely lovely. And then he sort of like has to take a trip to the Machine City, and they sort of like do this whole splitting off in the different ships and all that. What did you think of the Machine City and sort of like revisiting that again? Because the last time we saw it was in the first Matrix, and you saw like the people coming out the pods, but you probably get a view of this city and get an idea of what's happening there. What did you think about all that?
I thought it was pretty cool. I really liked it. I thought it looked great. He has a conversation with a big face, which is the subtitles call it Deus Ex Machina, which I don't know. It makes sense, doesn't it? God from the machine, as in terms of the translation of it, it does make sense. But it's a very loaded term, isn't it? You can't just be throwing the words Deus Ex Machina into your script without it having
any explanation
meanings
and stuff. Like that was a bit strange, because when I was watching it, I just thought it was the architect. Kind of in my head, it was like, okay, the architect is sort of like the main person looking after the Machine City. Is it just him? But that doesn't make sense, because the architect as a program will only live in the simulation.
Yeah, every program has such limited parameters. We've learned that from the last film. But it does beg the question, what is the parameters of that program?
Yeah, the weird baby face. I don't even know what it is. It's like made out of loads of squids, isn't it? Loads of sentinels.
Well, but that's important, isn't it? Because that does maybe suggest that it doesn't have any parameters. It's multiple. It's supposed to represent possibly multiple programs coming together to speak as one collective consciousness, I guess. I think that's what they're going for.
Yeah, that would make sense. So also, like, funny fact, the face is modelled after photographs of Lily Wachowski's infant nephew. So it is actually a baby face. So like I wasn't sure if it was a big baby's face or not when I was watching it, but yeah, that confirms it.
Very strange. But I didn't mind it.
It's a really good spectacle though. Like when it comes
Yeah.
floating up and it's got all like the spikes on it, like it looks like a big landmine or a sea mine.
It definitely has the feel of a boss level, doesn't it?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's the big boss of the Machine City.
Which is crucial to this point in the trilogy, isn't it? This is the hardest point in all three films, I think, in terms of scripting and directing and visuals. There's so much on the line here. This is the conclusion of the prophecy that was all mysterious and exciting in the first film. It has to look amazing, and it's not perfect, but I thought it was pretty good. It does capture that feeling, and if it feels like a boss level, then they're doing something right there, I think.
Yeah, it's got a lot of build up towards it, hasn't it? Like it's all building up to that final fight between Neo and Agent Smith in the Matrix. So he's finally going to sort of like beat him once and for all, hopefully. That's what we're thinking at this point.
Yeah, that's Neo's kind of gambit, is that if Smith is a virus in the Matrix, then Neo is offering to the machines to rid them of that virus, which is awfully convenient. I mean, it's very convenient for Neo that Smith has gone down this route and things have gone this way. Otherwise, he would have nothing to offer the machines for peace, would he?
Yeah, it's all a bit strange, isn't it? That whole part of it. So, like, at this point, he's lost Trinity as well. So he's kind of like, he's put, or like you said, it's his last gambit to sort of save humanity. He doesn't know what he's going to find in the Machine City. He knows he sort of is supposed to go back to the source and do something, but he never really lets on that he actually has any idea about anything at all. He's just sort of like, oh, I feel like I should go here and I feel like I should do this. So it's a bit sort of like, you don't really know, do you?
Yeah, presumably that's bullshit, right? He's got this plan that involves Smith, or is he just winging it and he's lucky that Smith has become so powerful in the meantime?
This is the thing as well, because like, so in that final scene, he says like he chose to. He says the words like, because I chose to do this. But he also says it was inevitable. So if he's having the choice and he chose to do what he wants to do, how is it always inevitable?
It's slightly having your cake and eating it too on the free will determinism question, isn't it?
But he's like, by saying it's inevitable, he's quoting it back to Smith, and that's like works well in terms of the script, because Agent Smith is constantly saying like, I am inevitable, I am going to like take over. But then Neo is sort of throwing that back at him.
But it fits in with basically what the Oracle's been saying the whole time as well, isn't it? She's on the position that, everything is predetermined. You make choices, but those choices are predetermined, and life is about understanding why you made those choices. Which, is a bit having your cake and eating it too, but it makes sense. It's got its own little logic, hasn't it? Everything could be predetermined, but you also are on a path of free will because you're unable to see things from the outside. So you're just experiencing predeterminism in your own little subjective way and coming to understand your choices.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to the purpose as well, because Neo is figuring out what his purpose is. And his purpose is to sort of like save humanity and sort of do what he can for the greater good. But he doesn't necessarily know the reasons behind it until he's sort of like faced with that final moment when he's fighting Smith. And the whole scene is amazing. Like, you've got all of these duplicated Smiths like down the path as he's walking up, and you've got the rain, and then apparently the rain again is like code. Like we said in the first Matrix, there's scenes where the rain is actually code. All of these sort of bits are like, there's so much spectacle to it. And then there's the proper like, this is like the superhero boss level fight, isn't it? They're flying around, they're punching each other through walls, they're going right up into the sky, coming down and forming massive craters. That's what it is. It's the superhero ending, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to say I loved this fight scene. I thought I was going to hate it because I remember it being ridiculous, and it certainly is ridiculous.
It certainly is.
But I really, really liked it. It was very anime, wasn't it? I think there's a lot of the Wachowskis love anime. They directed Speed Racer later, didn't they? So there's no secret there that they are anime fans. But yeah, I thought it was really cool. I think it was a little bit. So it's heavily implied that at this point, Smith, while we've been in the real world for this whole film, Smith has completely taken over the Matrix. There is no one in the Matrix left who isn't a Smith, right? Is that what we're supposed to understand?
Yeah, that's what it seems like, because they look at the code on the Nebuchadnezzar and they're sort of like going, oh, the code's all weird. Something's going on with the Matrix. And it is implied that Agent Smith has just taken over.
And he says, do you like what I've done with the place? And it's horrible. It's all raining and thunder and lightning. It was a tiny bit disappointing that there just wasn't time left in the film, because we'd had a bloody 20-minute war scene in Zion. There wasn't time to really see that. You've just got to take it as read that the streets are lined with Smiths. It's apocalyptic weather. He must have taken over the whole of the Matrix, but you don't really see that, do you? It would have been a bit interesting to see a bit more of that. But the film is moving at such a pace that we've just got time for an anime superhero fight, and that's it. And that's the big showdown, isn't it? And it was pretty cool.
And that reminded me of the thing which we talked about when we discussed The Matrix previously, like the fact that the Wachowskis had to draw storyboards like a comic in order to get the ideas of The Matrix sold to the company. So they've kind of gone back to that comic book-esque styling, and it's sort of all come to a head in this final scene.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that stuff with the storyboarding, because I was thinking to myself at times, how was this scripted? What does the script say when they're flying around in circles around each other in the air, and what is written on the page? Because basically for the last 10-15 minutes of the film, how would you write that? You just put in they fight.
Big fight scene.
Yeah. Just so hard to script, but I guess that's where their storyboarding talents come in, and they've got to put a lot of work in at the storyboard stage to make that scene make sense. And it just about makes visual sense.
Mr. Anderson, welcome back. We missed you. You like what I've done with the place?
It ends tonight.
I know it does. I've seen it. That's why the rest of me is just going to enjoy the show. Because we already know that I'm the one that beats you.
So it ends with Neo taking Smith into himself. He's becomes an agent, but then by doing that, he's kind of the antidote to all of these other Smiths. So is that because Neo is connected to the source at this point? He's plugged into the Machine City, and by doing that, the machines have a direct link to Agent Smith so they can delete him? Or is it just Neo's inbuilt superpowers that mean that when he's assimilated, he can just blow all of them up? And if that is the case, why doesn't he blow them all up previously?
Yeah. Is he magic or is it sci-fi?
The age-old question.
I hadn't considered that. That hadn't crossed my mind he was just basically opening the door. But they could, if they were able to do that, they could have done that at any time. Smith assimilates an agent in the second film when the big fight scene is happening there. An agent shows up and Smith just takes over his body. So I don't think the machines are able to do that. Smith would never have got the control that he had at the end of this one if they were just able to blow him up in a big ball of light just as soon as they had access to him, because they've had access to him, I think, pretty much the whole time.
It's a tricky one. But then if you say all the programs live in the program, they've got no way of getting someone in. They haven't got any way of like plugging someone in, plugging a different machine into the Matrix.
Yeah.
Again, it's all speculation, isn't it? Because we don't know what happens at the end, really. There's no sort of like definitive answer. But you do see Neo apparently die. Like he's on like a sort of like a funeral pyre almost when he's being taken off on this sort of like floating podium or whatever it is.
Yes. I'd forgotten that. I had forgotten 100% of the Matrix Revolutions. I'd completely forgotten it.
Not even 99%, 100%, the whole thing.
I couldn't remember a damn thing about it. So I'd completely forgotten that Neo dies at the end of it. I mean, they're making a Matrix 4, aren't they?
Yeah, with
Keanu Reeves.
And Trinity's died as well. So, but Carrie and Moss is coming back.
I mean, the only way that makes sense, James, is that the real world is not the real world.
There you go. That could be. And they have said in sort of interviews, I think it's just Lana Wachowski who's directing The Matrix 4. So, but what she's been saying sort of interviews and stuff is it's even more relevant now, what sort of like the themes and stuff of The Matrix than ever before. So maybe the simulation thing could continue and you've got another layer.
I know that the Merovingian's coming back, so there may also be something with their consciousnesses being, held in the Matrix, and the Merovingian's got the kind of the control there to just sort of hold them. We didn't talk about it, but it starts with the whole train station sequence that I quite liked. I like the idea that it's like another control program. We saw the control programs in the first film where you can like practice stuff. This one's a little world within a world built by the train man, and it's a prison within a prison as well, isn't it? Neo's stuck there until the train man allows him to re-enter the Matrix, and Neo has no power there because he's got all his superpowers because he's cracked the code of the Matrix, but the train man created the train station, so Neo's powers mean nothing there. He's not the one there.
Yeah, and he's even entered the Matrix without being plugged in, so that's another aspect to it, sort of like the weird control that he has over the Matrix. But yeah, looking forward to how the Matrix 4 could be and what things could happen in that. One of the prophecy things is that Neo will bring about peace, but that he will also destroy the Matrix. And that never happens in this. So like the Matrix ends with the programs and humanity sort of like having some sort of peace treaty. So it'll be interesting to see how that peace treaty goes, who breaks it, sort of what happens there, because like how long can peace last?
Yeah, that's the architect's point. I wonder if the Oracle and the Architect are going to come back in Matrix 4, because they seem to be quite important to that final dynamic, don't they? They're representing these tensions within the machine community. The Architect just wants like perfect, neat order. Everyone's under control, and then we do what we design the Matrix to do. The Oracle's a bit more, well, she's a program built to study human psychology, so she understands that much better than the Architect possibly can. So she understands this importance of freedom of choice, and that's where you get this treaty that you mentioned, which is basically the Oracle understands the importance of choice, and she thinks that it's important that people who want to leave the Matrix should be able to. So it goes back to, it all comes down to that freedom of choice thing. They're going to leave everyone in the Matrix who wants to, and let everyone leave who wants to leave, and work that out in the real world.
And like one thing that could potentially happen in the next one is maybe if Neo and Trinity are making a comeback, maybe they are programs in the new one. Like maybe they're brought back like that. Who knows? They've already sort of like, they established with the Oracle, because sadly the original actress passed away in between Reloaded and Revolutions, that programs can change appearance. And like they do that because obviously the original actress wasn't around to continue playing the role. But they've kind of established this thing that in the universe of the Matrix, you can have one program turn into someone else, like into a different appearance, but still be doing the same function. So maybe something like that happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. I think that could possibly work as well. And again, it would make sense for them to have that relationship with the Merovingian in some way, possibly. I don't know. Exciting.
Yeah. But this one ends with a beautiful sunrise, and you've got the Oracle on a bench. They talk to the architect. There's the little girl program we've seen previously. They're on a bench, which is like in memory of Thomas Anderson. Nice little touch. And
I didn't see that.
Yeah. And it's all sort of like, it's a different colour to the rest of the film. Like all of the other films have been sort of like tinged with this sort of like grey, green sort of like look. But this is the first sort of like fully colourful scene. So it ends on that sort of like really hopeful note. But it felt really quick to me. It felt just sort of like, Neo's dead, there's peace, the end, done.
Yeah, I agree. But we've seen that before in other films. Like it's so hard to do anything after a big, a massive climax like the fight scene at the end of this film, and you've just got to wrap it up. And it did feel it felt a bit damp, didn't it? Just like, oh, it's a pretty sky. That's the end. It was very strange. I think it's supposed to feel a bit Wizard of Oz, isn't it? You're right. It is so much more colourful than anything that's ever happened inside the Matrix, but it just didn't have that impact of like a Wizard of Oz moment. It's also Satie who creates that skyline, isn't it? And there's something there about these programs without a purpose being now allowed to exist in the Matrix and express themselves through their freedom of choice and do something that they want to do rather than what their pre-designated purpose is. Although you could just argue that Satie is a program whose purpose is to make nice skylines.
But then she wasn't supposed to be a program in the first place, was she? Because she's like an illegal program birth. Yeah, who knows where they're going to go for Matrix 4, but I am excited and intrigued to find out where and what's going to happen next.
So in The Matrix, we talked about how you're living in a dream world and you can be woken up, and you have to have some help to do that. Normally in The Matrix, people don't just tend to realise it for themselves. Morpheus has to come along and give you the red pill so that you wake up. Next time on the show, we're going to be looking at characters who are coming to that realization for themselves. They've got some suspicions about exactly what's going on with reality. They're questioning the reality around them. What are the films that we're going to be looking at for that, James?
So next week, we are looking at the sci-fi noir classic Dark City from 1998, and we're also going to be looking at The Zero Theorem from 2013 from Terry Gilliam.
That's going to be an exciting one, so join us for that. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with the show, drop us an email at journeythroughscifi@gmail.com, or you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and we have a Facebook discussion group that you can join if you want to talk about any of these films with us.
If you would like to support the podcast, we are on Patreon. You can find us on there. Just look up Journey Through Sci-Fi and you'll find our page. You can join a tier and get bonus episodes if you go to Warp Speed.
And if you head over there this week, we'll be looking at the Animatrix. So our Animatrix episode is up for your enjoyment. If you don't want to join Patreon, you can always leave us a review. That would be really helpful. Drop us a review and let us know what you think is going to happen in Matrix 4.
That's it for this week. We'll see you next time.